Hello everyone, today we'll be making a part 2 to should I upgrade my PC, so let's get into it. In today's video we'll be focusing more in depth on what parts you should upgrade and what parts are perfectly fine. This may require some benchmarking and monitoring, but in the end it's worth it when you upgrade the correct part. You can't just go, my PC is slow, then upgrade your RAM. That is just not how things work, and don't get me wrong, sometimes RAM can cause slow PCs. It's just a super common thought to PC novices that upgrading RAM solves everything. Here today we will start with the parts that you would least expect need upgrading first. Let's start with your CPU cooler first. Your CPU cooler can be a pretty important part within your system, as it does cool one of the main components of your PC. Your cooler over time may degrade, your fan may get worse over time, and if you don't keep your cooler clean, then it will start to make your CPU overheat. Before upgrading your cooler, make sure your cooler is clean, but if your cooler is incapable of cooling your CPU, then you still may want to upgrade that first. Also, before upgrading your cooler, make sure your thermal paste is good and not all hardened up. This part of the video is a bit of an iffy topic. If you want to overclock your CPU, then you may need to get a better cooler, but you do not always need to upgrade your cooler. Second part of this video we'll be talking about your PC case. Another item that may not need to be upgraded per se, but an upgrade can be nice sometimes. Your PC case can be vital for cooling, and if your PC case can't cool well enough, then you may want to think about an upgrade. Usually a case upgrade will happen when you upgrade your main PC parts and you'd need some better cooling and more modern features in your case. Before you upgrade your case, make sure your CPU and GPU coolers are up to spec and are not the reason for high temps. If then, you may want to think about upgrading your case fans first. Then if your case has terrible airflow just in general, then just upgrade your whole case. After those two parts out of the way, we can move on to the more serious parts of your PC and the likely contenders to actually need upgraded. It's not super common that you'll need to upgrade a case and or cooler, but I wanted to add them in the video anyways. When should you upgrade your CPU? Your CPU can affect your computer's performance in a few ways: general usability in Windows, gaming, rendering, etc. This video we will focus more on upgrading your parts for gaming, but may touch upon rendering. We will definitely not go into depth with rendering as I'm not too adept in that area. In gaming, your CPU most of the time is not pegged to 100%. It's only pegged when you're using an old CPU that just cannot keep up with your current GPU and or game. The time to upgrade your CPU depends on a few things: core count and your IPC/single core speed. If you have good single core speed, then your CPU will be good for games using just 1 to 2 cores. If your CPU has multiple cores but low single core speed, then you may want to swap that CPU out for gaming purposes. Rendering purposes, on the other hand, your single core speed may not matter as much. For gaming in 2020, I would recommend that you get the bare minimum a 4-core and 8-threaded CPU. I would say get a 6-core 12-threaded CPU for an optimal cheap experience, and then 8-core 16-thread if you want to keep your CPU for a few extra years. And to mention, anything below 4-core 8-thread will probably stutter or not do well in the games as you are lacking core/thread count. In older games, 4-core 4-thread, 2-core 4-thread, that'll work just fine, but in modern 2020 titles, it's going to really struggle. When you upgrade your CPU, check if you need cores or single core speed for the games you play. If you tend to play older games that use single core and you're using a slow CPU, then look for something that can hold up to your standards and don't focus too much on the core count. If your CPU is pegged in a game because lack of cores, then look for a CPU with a fair core count and thread count. But keep IPC/single core speed in mind, as it still plays an important role for your FPS numbers. To sum up this part of the video, check if you need single core or multi-core for the games you play, and upgrading determining to that. The next computer component we will be talking about is your GPU and when you should upgrade that. Your CPU can actually bottleneck your GPU, so always make sure your CPU is perfectly capable of playing games while having your GPU at 100%. If your CPU is also 100% or close enough, and you want to upgrade your GPU, then upgrade your CPU first, or both at the same time, because you won't really see an FPS upgrade with a better GPU if your CPU is at 100% always, and you may get frame time issues. Now that it is determined that your CPU is okay, upgrading your GPU, you need to check a few things. First, check what settings you are wanting and what FPS you want to get. If you want the same settings, just higher FPS, or if you want max settings with good FPS, that's something for you to think about and consider when upgrading your GPU. Obviously, the higher settings, the more FPS you want, the better GPU you will need. So if you want both, then you're going to need an even better GPU than if you want just higher FPS or higher settings. You also need to keep VRAM in mind. A 6 gig card will work okay in 2020, but you may want to get 8 gigs of VRAM or more to get those high settings that will use up all your precious VRAM. Also, you need to keep resolution in mind. 4K will use more VRAM than 1080p. Even when all the settings are the same, they're all exactly alike except for resolution, of course, you will use more VRAM with a higher resolution as you're pushing more pixel density. So you should really upgrade your card if you're running out of VRAM and or if your performance is not up to expectations. And now we move on to RAM, the part that everyone tells you to get more of, because more RAM equals more performance, right? Well, that's not always the case, obviously. The only time you should upgrade your RAM if the speeds are too slow and or if your RAM amount is just too little for your uses. One example of RAM being too slow is if you have 1066 MHz DDR3 RAM and you can upgrade to something like 1600 MHz plus pretty cheaply. Now, you can sometimes overclock low clock the RAM to those speeds, but you also have to keep timings in mind, just make sure they aren't too loose. The higher the number on the timings, the looser they are, so you want those numbers to be as low as possible. Make sure to do your research if you do adjust timings, as it does take quite a bit. Couple hours of research, or you could just have someone help you along the way. Now, I wouldn't recommend upgrading your, let's say, 16GB RAM kit to another 16GB kit that's faster with better timings. It's just not worth the money in my opinion, unless the RAM is extremely cheap. When you should upgrade your RAM though is if you're maxing out or within 10% of maxing out your RAM. I would really recommend to just double the amount of RAM you have, and that should last you quite a while. So if you have 8GB of RAM and you're using, let's say, 7.7GB while gaming, I would really say to just get 16GB of RAM pretty soon. We are down to just 2 PC parts left for the usual PC, the power supply and the motherboard. I'll be going over the motherboard first here. Your motherboard usually would not need upgraded much unless you are swapping platforms. The only reasons to upgrade your motherboard is if you're using, let's say, a cheap A320 board with really bad VRMs and you want to get a Ryzen 9 3950X, let's say. Then at that point, yes, you would want to upgrade your motherboard to something better that has VRMs that can actually handle a 3950X. While a 3950X will fit in an A320 and it may even turn on, bad VRMs won't be able to handle the CPU very well. Another reason to upgrade your motherboard is if you are swapping platforms, going from a DDR3 platform to a DDR4 platform, or going from, let's say, LGA 1156 to a new LGA 1151 board, etc. Also, my second to last statement, beware that not all LGA 1151 CPUs are compatible in all boards, same with other CPUs that use the same slot, so some AM4 CPUs may not fit in some other AM4 CPUs. Back when X570 first came out, first gen Ryzen would fit in the boards as it is an AM4 CPU, but they would not turn on as the BIOS did not support them. You can also upgrade a motherboard determining on features as well, such as PCIe slots, USB slots, etc. But I will only do that if it's an absolute must. I would not go, oh, I need one more USB, let me buy a $100 motherboard. No, you could just get a cheap USB hub instead. I'm only talking about if you absolutely need the features upgraded and you can afford it. The very last part we will be going over in this longer video is your power supply. This part is also a fairly simple part. Do some research on how much power your parts will use and get a power supply within 100 to 200 watts extra is my recommendation. If your PC uses 300 watts worth of power, I would say get a 500 to 550 watt power supply. This will leave you room for power supply degradation and will also leave room for small upgrades. For the people wanting to know if they have to upgrade their power supply, as said above, research how much power your new parts will use and go from there. Also, make sure you get at the very minimum an 80 plus rated power supply. I personally just go for 80 plus gold power supplies, as they're not the most expensive ever, but they are quite reliable. 80 plus bronze units will work as well, but the basic white rated aka 80 plus EVGA power supplies, for example, will do their very basic job, but are not the most reliable things on earth. I've seen plenty of them die. And I'm not picking out EVGA here, I'm just using them as an example because I've had the most experience with their white rated power supplies. Thanks for watching the video, everyone. This is a basic intro to what parts you should upgrade. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, do all that stuff, and see ya.